Silva, who is the Siegel Family Assistant Professor in Jewish History and Culture in the Department of Jewish Studies at McGill University in Montreal. He earned his PhD in history from UCLA and is the recipient of awards from the Posen Foundation, the American Academy of Jewish Research, and the American Institute for Maghreb Studies. Silva's scholarship on Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia has appeared in the International Journal of Middle East Studies, Hesperis Tamuda, AJS Perspectives, History Today, and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Holocaust Encyclopedia. His first book, Recording History, Jews, Muslims, and Music Across 20th Century North Africa, is forthcoming from Stanford University Press in 2022. Without further ado, it is my great pleasure to hand over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Eric, Vanessa, Matthew, and the entire team for inviting me. And thanks to everyone participating today. I'm going to share my screen in a second. And exactly like Eric said, I'm going to start. The point of today is to come together at sort of year's end, semester's end for some listening. It's how great it would be to do this in a living room together, but today we're going to do this over Zoom as best we possibly can. While I'm talking at the beginning, I would love to see you if possible. So if you're in a situation that's not somehow compromising, I would love it if I could see your faces. I know many of you, and it's a real treat to be able to get together. And then what I'll suggest is that when we actually listen to the music, go ahead, turn it off. Exactly like Eric said, pour yourself a beverage of your choice. No judgment here at all. I can see some people have already done that, and I'll sort of I'll then we'll play a bunch of music and then we'll come together to discuss. So thank you for doing that. I'm going to do the same thing I always do, which is awkwardly share my screen and talk through it. So give me a second as I do that. One second, that's what I'm doing. Okay, now you should be able to see awkwardly a PowerPoint, is that right? Yeah, okay, let me do that. Okay, now it should look pretty okay. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, okay. Another question is, will the sound actually work? But we'll see. Okay, one second. Okay. So over 110 years ago, the towering Algerian musical figure Lahu Saror walked into a makeshift pate recording studio in a hotel ballroom in Algiers. Already at that early date, the recording industry in North Africa was more than a decade in the making, its origin stretching back to the tail end of the 19th century into a particular figure by the name of Edmond Nathan Yafil. Like Saror, Alfred Sassi Levrati, the 20-something mandolinist who was by his side more than a century ago, and an overwhelming number of North Africa's first recording artists, artistic directors, and record concessionaires, Yafil, who embodied all three of those positions, was Jewish. Around 1910, when this record was made, the one you can see here, Algerian Jews, French citizens since 1870 by dint of the Camus Decree, were supposed to have cared little for the quote-unquote indigenous arts, for Arab music. But the sounds embedded in the grooves of early Algerian records, as we'll soon hear, speak to a very different story. Now that Eliaus Lahu Saror was pivotal to the effort to preserve, promote, and perfect Algerian music has been established by contemporary scholarship, in the memoirs of Yafil's protege Mahyeddin Bashtarzi, and of course from the historical record. Saror, for example, born in 1860 and himself a disciple of Sheikh Mohammed bin Ali Sfinja, was critical to Yafil's turn of the 20th century transcription effort to render the Andalusian repertoire fit for the piano, and which resulted in the path-breaking publications Répertoire de musique arabe et mort. Along with his co-religionist Mazzino, Saror was also among the pioneers of commercial phonograph recording in North Africa, doing so initially on a series of wax cylinders in their early aughts as part of what Yafil labeled appropriately Collection Yafil. If this wasn't enough, still later, Saror, a cobbler by trade, would prove vital to the establishment of Yafil's legendary orchestra El Mutrabia and subsequent interwar association come orchestras. Nonetheless, for more than a century, his actual voice has escaped us. His recordings never reissued. With our session, all of that begins to change. That the North African recording industry was both growing and in flux by 1910 is borne out on our first record, which we'll soon hear. This includes, again, as we'll see shortly, a selection from the Inqilabat, the instrumental overtures to the Nuba, the multimodal suites at the core of the high art Andalusian repertoire. Indeed, while all of the records we will audition this afternoon or evening spun at what would become a standard 78 rotations per minute, measured on average 10 inches or 25 centimeters in diameter, and held about 3 minutes of music per side, this disc that we'll hear after this presentation spins at 80 rotations per minute, measures nearly 14 inches or 35 centimeters in diameter, and contains about 4 minutes of music per side. As Saror and Sassi performed acoustically, positioned just so in front of a phonograph horn connected to a stylus, the music on this record was vertically cut, another anomaly, buried deep at the bottom rather than on the sides of its grooves, making its surfacing that much more difficult, and we'll hear that soon as well. Finally, this 14-inch, 80 rotations per minute record is also an outlier, as this will be the only recording we listen to that belongs expressly to one of the overlapping Arabo-Andalusian traditions that have garnered the lion's share of attention from scholars of early to mid-20th century North African music. Now, by the end of the 1920s, and thanks to Saror, Sassi, Yafil, and others, hundreds of thousands of records were circulating in North Africa, including across colonial and imperial borders. Consumed in cafes, bars, restaurants, cabarets, theaters, and even brothels, as well as in private homes, record sales exploded in the interwar period. In part, this was thanks to the advent of electrical recording via the microphone, which allowed for a greater range of sounds to be captured on disc. But the success of Yafil's revolutionary endeavor also owed to a coterie of Jewish stars and superstars, many of them women, who rose to fame as tastemakers across North Africa at the time. Their popular songs, which again, given what the technological medium allowed for, were roughly 3 minutes in length, captured a certain working class encounter with modernity that was as true for the urban Jewish masses as it was for their Muslim counterparts. It did so, and we'll hear this as well, in the colloquial Arabic and local idiom of everyday people, which sometimes included a smattering of French and other European languages. Indeed, hundreds of individual record titles released during the interwar years explored and shaped new ideas about love, marriage, and the role of women in society. To accomplish that feat, lyrics were set to styles like the foxtrot, the Charleston, and rumba, while also employing in-demand Egyptian musical modes. Among the most popular records of the period, the popularity of which can be discerned not only in the more than a half dozen covers it engendered, but also in actual sales figures, was Mamak. Let's see if this comes up. Okay, you can see that, I hope. Which literally is your mother or your mama, but which translates as don't tell your mama in this setting, which was originally released by the Algerian Jewish artist Lili La'abasi on Columbia, as you can see here, and was self-described by La'abasi as an Arab foxtrot. Now, the various takes on La'abasi's Arab foxtrot, in which an unmarried Here's another version we'll hear shortly, in which an unmarried man implores his female lover to keep their relationship a secret, hence the "don't tell your mama," were all slightly different but equally salacious. For her recording of Mamak for Pate in 1830, the Moroccan Jewish artist Sheikha Aisha Laibrea, the Jewess, set the story in Oran, Algeria, assumed the male part, and using language that invoked a crucial pre-wedding ritual, entreated her mistress, quote, "Don't tell your mama why you skipped the henna," end quote. That same year, and for the same label, the Marrakesh-based Jewish duo of Simon Ohayon and Hazar Cohen recorded another version in which the euphemism of leapfrogging the henna ceremony for the post-nuptial consummation was now made explicit, albeit in another geographical context, this time in Mogador. Between 1930 and 1932, alongside the Moroccan releases, no fewer than 6 records entitled Mamak or something similar were also made by Algerian artists for 4 different labels. This included the original on Columbia, written, composed, and performed by the Algerian Jewish musician Lili Abbasi. By the mid-1930s, thousands of copies of the Mamak record in one interpretation or another by figures with names like Madame Louisa al-Israeliya, Louisa the Jewess, Madame Ghazala, etc., circulated across North Africa, in metropolitan France, and possibly in Spain, where Sheikha Aisha Laibrea had long made her career as a flamenco artist. Mamak and its analogues were no passing phenomenon. In the years after World War II, that song in particular could still be heard across Morocco and Algeria, irking a vocal minority. In April and May of 1946, as Malcolm Theodore has shown, Gontran Dessin, director of the Algiers Conservatory, lambasted, quote, the foreign influence of new songs with mixed French and Arabic lyrics, end quote. Among the worst offenders, according to him, was still, quote, the foxtrot Mamak, end quote, despite it having been released more than a decade and a half earlier. In 1947, the composer Léo Louis Barbès saw fit to condemn, quote, the immense success of numbers like Mamak, this foxtrot that not a shoeshine boy from Souk Ahras to Oujda did not know by heart and sing daily during a certain period, end quote. For Barbès, the song, quote, trotted out all night long in the cafes of the Petit Bled for the easy to please, end quote, was not deserving of the title of Arab music. He preferred another word, decadence. We can make our own judgment as we listen to one of the most popular records of interwar North Africa. Now, following Mamak, we move to Tunisia in order to be grabbed and possessed by a 1928 recording of the Nubat Jnoun, which includes the pulsating sounds of Khailou Skhir on Mizwid, the Tunisian bagpipe, and Sion Bisana on Bendir, a type of frame drum. Together, the two count as among the greatest exponents of the two often neglected trance healing traditions of North Africa. Here, the point is the range of music and questions of class that records surface beyond the sometimes staid domain of more standard narratives. Now, of course, that range also pertains to the realm of languages. And so we gather for 2 Hebrew language records made at 2 very different moments in time. The first, this one here, a problematic source, if ever there was one, comes from one of 14 ethnographic recordings made in 1937 by the Italian ethnomusicologist Paolo Tocci for fascist Italian radio. The selections we will listen to were recorded in a synagogue in Tripoli, complete with children's choir, and includes the Jewish wedding blessing known as the Sheba Brachot. The other is a post-war recording, a Moroccan recording made for the Olympia label of Eliyahu Anavi, Elijah the prophet, by one Abraham Arzwan, himself a staple of Radio Moroc's Le Voix des Communautés, a Jewish radio program which lasted until 1965. Here then is a sense of the musico-linguistic diversity carried on record and amplified further still on radio. Now, our session will end with the sublime voice of the Algerian Jewish icon, Salim Hilali, at once among the most influential, best recognizable, and least known, biographically speaking, popular artists of 20th century North Africa. With this 1945 recording, this one here that I know is difficult to see, we are reminded that huge swaths of his nearly 2-decade output on 78 RPM record remain to be seen and heard. Finally, it is December of 2021, and we are tired, and we are in need of just a bit of uplift. And so we will conclude fittingly with the Algerian Jewish Ambiance Blanc Blanc. On this 1952 release for Pate, he provides us not with original music, but with what he labeled Chukchuka, a series of musical impressions, including of the aforementioned Hilali, Bashtarzi, and La'abasi. That both the structure of the spoken introduction of North African recordings and the artists themselves were still an undeniable part of the soundscape at mid-20th century will become more than evident. Now, together we will now listen. I will quickly reintroduce each record, and then each side will be played in its entirety. Something I normally don't do, but something I think this group will be able to handle. In other words, normally what I do in these sort of scenarios is we play a snippet of music, maybe 30 or 45 seconds, and then move on to the next. I'm going to let these stand on their own. And again, this is sort of the point where you can turn off your screen, imbibe what you please, and listen to the music in the fashion that you see fit. Now, all told, when we start listening to when it finishes, we're going to listen to about 25 minutes of music. And again, listen to the music in the way that works best for you. At the end, I'll say just another sentence or two to wrap up, and then we'll come back for Q&A. Let me see if I have any final notes. Okay. Now, one final note before we actually get to the matter at hand is to say that just about everything you hear today has never been re-released or otherwise made available. And in some cases, that means in more than a century. Now, some of it, especially the first recording we're going to hear, shows signs of its age in all senses of the word. In other words, the first recording you're going to hear, and that's that 80 rotations per minute, circa 1910 recording from Algiers on a 14-inch or 35-centimeter disc, is going to have a lot of surface noise. And I'm aware of that, and it's something that I'm just going to ask you to sort of live with and try and hear past the surface noise for the music itself. Now, what's remarkable is that on most of the other recordings, you will hear some things, some clicks and bumps and things like that. But all in all, the recordings are rather remarkable, as pristine as can be expected. And so hopefully that will come through as well. Even though this is the first time that these are being played, I want to make sure that this isn't the only setting that they're heard. So all of these recordings will soon be added and contextualized on Gharamophone.com, the archival project I've curated for some years now, and of course, which I'm also happy to speak about at the end. Now, we're going to transition to the music now. And what I would also say is that, hold on, there's something in the chat. Let's see. Thank you. What I will also say is, if you're on headphones or somewhere public or whatever it is, I don't know how loud this is going to come out on your end. and I want to be sensitive to your ears and your environment. So just turn it down at the beginning, and then you can crank it up as desired. So we are going to play this first recording now. Again, this is Eliaou Laou Saror, Algiers, about 1910, and in fact, possibly earlier as well. This is a well-known piece from the Andalusian repertoire, and faintly above the surface noise, you may also be able to hear the great mandolinist, who was sometimes described as the seal of the mandolinists in Algeria, Sasi Labrati. So you'll hear his instrumentals behind Laou Saror's voice. And this is about 4 minutes.
قدر يبليك يا لا 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 نجم الزادي بليك يا وزادي عبالي الله يا لا 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 عبالي الله يا لا 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 يا لا لا من بالهوى تحقوا يا الله تحقوا يا الله يا لا 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 يا لا لا عقلي ما ضاع ردوا يا الله يا عليم ما في غيوب السرير الجاري قولي بما بين القلوب يسلمين صبري هذا الهوى له حب لا ترى كاف صباح صباح ترباح كاف صباح صباح ترباح الفرح باين والعز باين
Okay, we let me just see if I can see everybody. Okay. We continue now, moving forward in time to one of those hit records that I described earlier. We're still in Algeria, and here is a recording of Mamak from 1930. This is the song about not telling one's mother or someone else's mother about skipping the henna ceremony. So this is Lili Abbasi's version, and we'll take a listen to that now.
أسحان كولومبيا.
تفاهمنا بالعينين تهاعدنا باليدين قالت لي نهار الاثنين قول لي فاين نلقاك شوف فيا وفهمني يا الغزالة ديالي وعلاش تمحني ما تقولهاش لماماك ماماك ماماك ما تقولهاش لماماك لبست ميواتيها الكحل في عينيها ربي اللي يحظيها قالت لي ما ننساك شوف فيا وفهمني يا الغزالة ديالي وعلاش تمحني ما تقولهاش لماماك نهواك نهواك العقل والروح معاك قلت لها يا ولفي هعبك راهو وفي راني خايف تجفي وانا قلبي يهواك شوف فيا وفهمني يا الغزالة ديالي وعلاش تمحني ما تقولاش لماماك نهواك نهواك العقل والروح معاك جوزنا داك نهار بالخمرة والأوصار زال علينا الغيار قالت لي ما ننساك شوف فيا وفهمني يا الغزالة ديالي وعلاش تمحني ما تقولاش ليماك يماك يماك العقل والروح معاك
Same song, same time, this time by Mademoiselle Ghazala, also in Colombia. We'll take a listen to that now.
أسحان كولومبيا.
ضلوا يسكروا بالكيس
We now move to Tunisia, 1928. We listen to some Mizwid and Bendir, the Tunisian bagpipe and frame drum, and part of one of the many Trans-Helian traditions. Two musicians, Tunisian Jewish musicians by name Khelu Skhir and Sion Bisana, 1928. We're now going to listen to, in fact, three Hebrew recordings. These are, the first two are part of that, problematic is not even a strong enough word, but ethnographic recordings, 14 in total, made in Libya in 1937 under fascist Italian direction. The first recording we're going to hear is one of Sheva Brachot, the wedding, Jewish wedding blessing, and then we're going to hear Baruch Haba, a welcome, a song of welcome.
صافي مرنا
يحييك
باروك التاض
باروك شموس
إلهينو ملك عذاب
أشيم زازون وسمحة حسن وكلا قيلا وهنا بيساوي حدوى أبا ويهوى
حطان نعمك الله
Amen.
And now we'll listen to the second piece here, Baruch Haba. We listen to our second Hebrew language disc here, moving forward in time to the post-war period. This is mid-1950s on an independent label called Olympia. And here we have Abraham Arzawan with Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the Prophet.
This one at Olympia, Abraham Arzwan.
إليך יוצר העולם אתן שיר תודה ושבחה תמיד אבטחה
So, what would any one of these presentations be without the great Algerian Jewish icon Salim Hilali? So now we're going to hear one of his early post-war records from 1945. Again, to give you a sense of this towering figure, his voice and his sound as well.
اسطوانات بابي سليم هلالي
هادي لونها الخمري، هادي لونها الخمري، والله مش شايفني لعمري، حاير ناري مجمر جمري، والله باش نقدر نسليها، حاير ناري مجمر جمري، والله باش نقدر نسليها. هذا لونها الخمري، والله شايفني لعمري، حاير ناري مجمر جمري، والله باش نقدر نسليها. العين وداها شفرة مدبل كانت راها، محل من بالك تنساها، لا عدت لها كان بيها، محل من بالك تنساها، من بالك تنساها، لا عدت لها كان بيها. هذا لونها الخمري، والله شايفني لي عمري، حاير ناري مجمر جمري، والله باش نقدر نسليها.
Okay, so this is our last one. Let me just make myself visible for a second, because why not? Hold on a second. Okay, so this is one I described way back when at the beginning of this. I still just remember being sort of totally floored when I first heard this record. This is 1952, recorded in Algeria by Blanc Blanc, whose real name was Albert Roime. And what he does here, and what you're going to hear here, is a series of impressions, and he's going to do 4 in total, and he's going to both impersonate the spoken introductions that accompany many of the recordings we heard, where they say "Istwanat pate" or "Istwanat Gharamophone," and then he's going to sing in the style of a number of artists. So this is a little bit inside baseball, but I think it can still be appreciated even for those who are sort of new to these musicians and their music.
Istwanat pate. سليم هلال. ريت الزين الزين بالخان كحلت العين
اسطوانات غراموفون الشيخ محي الدين بشترزي. يا قلبي خلي الحال والفاني ما قالوا وترك جميع الاخوال وصغالي ما قالوا. اسطوانات غراموفون الشيخ ليلى العباسي المشهور. لا يلغت الصحراء شوف لي غزال منو مالك تعشيس مسل حي مسل. اسطوانات باتي الشيخ زوزو l'inimitable chanteur oranais. ماني منظر نشكي وماني من الجرح عادم ولكن اشتكي لربي هو بالقلب عالم. أنا اللي امتحنت من صغري أنا اللي امتحنت من صغري صبتني الطفولة وزنا مكان صرت في خلافة نجري طلبت عقلي بالطفولة والتيام أنا غشل وما زلت ضري أنا اللي امتحنت من صغري.
So let me just add a few sentences by way of conclusion, and then you can turn your videos back on, and then we can come together for Q&A or conversation or whatever makes sense for people. But I just want to say a couple of things. First, that music is a world is clear to most of us here. Indeed, it is many worlds. It's a universe. And in this universe, the one that we just heard, North African history sounds different. But just because this history has been buried between the grooves of a set of novel archival sources does not render this an alternate universe. It very much existed, but the onus has long been on us to listen for it. So I'm going to end it there and say thank you, and then open it up for questions and conversation.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you so much. Yeah, clapping hands. So now it's time for questions, for conversation. If you have a question, you could put it in the chat, or you can raise the hand icon or raise just your hand. I would like to start with a question. Could you tell us a little bit more about Gharamophone? I remember reading one of your blog entries back in 2012 for the first time on the Jewish Maghreb jukebox. And I think in 2017 you started Gharamophone. Can you explain also what it means, the term, and what you envision with this project?
Yeah, so I mean, let me see if I can do this sort of as succinctly as possible. In 2009, I was in Casablanca. I happened upon an actual record store and was introduced to this world of music, and I purchased some things and fell in love with at first, in fact, a figure that I know is quite close to Vanessa, and this is Haim Botbol. He was sort of one of my entry points into this world of music. And I essentially, from 2009 moving forward, started to collect, gather, sort of make sense of this music, and sort of read it not just for sort of what the music told us, but what the sort of the label at the record center told us, sort of all of the figures, components, pieces that go into making music. I said I wanted to understand as best I could music, not just as sort of the genius of a couple or a few individuals, but as a whole team of sort of those in front of the microphone, those behind the scenes, how it worked, what the story was, etc. So, you know, this was I don't know if I was like an on-time adapter or an early adapter or a late adapter of sort of the world of blogging, but it was a way for me to sort of communicate this interest to people, and also to elicit help, also to sort of come seek out the experts that are obviously out there, that grew up with this music or made this music or whatever it was, to help all of us better understand it. And then in 2017, I decided that, you know, I wanted to, as best I could, sort of tell the beginning of the story of recording in North Africa. You know, what did those earliest sounds sound like? I had collected over the years some hundreds of 78 RPM recordings from across North Africa, and I didn't want them to just live in my living room, right? I didn't want them to go from one set of shelves to another set of shelves. So as best I could, I started digitizing them, contextualizing them, not just for sort of what is the song about, but what was the context in which it was made. And so that's the genesis of Gharamophone, which is a play on words, born of sort of a friend and collaborator who was an expert in this sort of wordplay, Bashir from Tukadim, which itself is a play on words, but Gharamophone, gharam meaning love in Arabic, one of the words for love, but also sounding quite close to gramophone as well. And so as best I can, I digitize at least a side of a record a month, hopefully both sides, put it in context and repatriate it to the soundscape. And so that's the project, and it's been quite successful, I would say, in terms of I've had the good fortune of connecting to the descendants of some of these musicians who, in fact, in some cases never had a chance to hear the original recordings of their grandparents in some cases, and now, thanks to this, are able to for the first time, but also to help fill out the story as well. And of course, you know, now that it's available to anyone with an internet connection, sort of the possibilities are limitless. Not just sort of getting a sort of a deeper sense of what North Africa once sounded like, but of course these pieces can be, if they've fallen out of circulation, could re-enter into circulation, be reinterpreted, and so that's the genesis of the project, and sort of that's some of its outcomes as well.
Great, thank you. So any questions?
I'm looking in the chat here.
Yeah, we can go to the chat. Yeah, so the first question was actually raised by Brenda Dixon-Gottschild. She was asking if there are also films of these early artists.
Yeah, and I really like how Brenda asked about found films. Thanks, because that's, I mean, so there were films, and the question is, are they still sort of out there as well? So there certainly were some, I know of some recordings from, film recordings from Tunisia around 1930 of musicians, sort of shorts, for lack of a better word, with sort of ambiguous titles like Arab musician at piano, which in fact is one of the great Tunisian Jewish pianists, Masoud Habib. And there's some film footage of Louisa Tunisia as well, and some others that I didn't get to play. And there was also footage of Habiba Masika, the great Tunisian Jewish diva, born 1903 and killed in 1930, murdered in 1930. But this has not been found, the Masika footage. There's also some film that you can find online through the University of South Carolina, I think, of El Mutarabia performing in, I now am blanking, I think in Nice, maybe, but you can see El Mutarabia, the orchestra founded by Edmond Natanyafil. There's footage of them from quite early performing as well. When we get into the later periods, there's other film, but so it once existed, and the question now is how much of it can we find, and where is it? And I see that Eli also has a question that I have to read.
Maybe I read it out, or
sure, yeah,
recording as well. So,
you don't want my face
or Ellie,
okay.
Do you want to read it? No, okay. So thank you so much for this session. It was fascinating to listen to this diverse set of recordings and voices. Can you say something about the accompaniment in these recordings? Something about the development or the different use of this technology from a dialogue between vocal instrument to more complex production? And what does these productions tell us about notions of community or musical networks that are beyond the status of a singular artist?
These are fantastic questions, and ones with long answers that I'll try and keep as short as possible. Thank you. Let me see, technology and accompaniment, vocal and instrumental. I mean, like in broad strokes, and I hope I'm actually answering this, and if not, just give me like a thumbs down if that's an icon. As the recording industry starts, of course, there are limitations. And this is sort of true in North Africa as it is elsewhere around the world. So there are limitations to acoustic recording that will change with the advent of the microphone and electrical recording in about 1925. And what that means is that sort of in general, we can say that certain pitches are favored with acoustic that aren't necessarily required for the electrical era. So you tend to get these a sort of a predilection for the high-pitched in the acoustic era. And in fact, we sort of come to associate that sound with really old recordings as well. So, you know, part of this is because of the sensitivity of the cutting stylus, sort of, you know, something too deep and booming could dislodge it as it's sort of creating the music between the grooves. And so there are sort of very clear sonic differences, not entirely, but in general, very clear sonic differences between the very first recordings on disc, and then the later recordings sort of post electrical 1925. And then there's the whole business of the cylinder as well. So cylinder sort of rotating at 160 rotations per minute and holding about 2 minutes of music per side. The advantage of the cylinder was that, in fact, you could sort of, they were, I don't know what to compare them to, but they could be erased and re-recorded. And so that's sort of allowed for some very interesting innovation at the beginning of the 20th century. It also means that you could add more instruments post 1925. You could sort of fill out that those accompanying instrumentalists post 1925, whereas it was much more difficult to sort of do that with a large orchestra in the acoustic era. In terms of the networks, this is, part and parcel of this story. So Yafil, for example, who's sort of the pioneer of recording in North Africa, isn't just friendly with Saror, who we heard at the outset. They share an office. And that office, in fact, is Yafil's house in the Kasbah. And Malcolm Teoler, a France-based researcher who wrote a fantastic dissertation, has also shown how, with the sort of the Al-Mutrabiya, that pioneering orchestra of Algeria and North Africa, most of its members lived within 200 square meters of one another in the Kasbah. And you can continue to draw out these connections. Marie Soussan, who's one of the great female artists and actors of the Algerian stage and theater at the beginning of the 20th century, is a cousin of Yafil, and you can continue to sort of to map this out in various ways. That's just the Algerian case, but we could do that in Tunisia and Morocco as well. And then the other thing is, of course, that the borders, as we all know and has been discussed sort of this is the basis of this series, are quite malleable and fungible, right? So Salim Helali, of course, is Algerian, but will spend the post-war era in Morocco, in Casablanca. Many of these musicians will tour across North Africa, including in Libya. So I wanted to make sure to include Libya in this presentation because it's so often and unfairly gets left out of this equation. So many Tunisian artists and others were touring in Libya as well, and sort of the movement was going all around. So that's part of the story too. Julian asked, what's the market for these recordings? Was it North African, French? What the sales figures could have been? Any idea if they were advertised? So the market was mostly for North Africans, including both those in North Africa and those in metropolitan France. Sometimes these records were also available for sort of curious Europeans. And so they were sold in record stores, in some of these recordings were sold in record stores in Paris. And if someone was just sort of, perusing, they could have picked them up as well. So they eventually circulated quite widely, some in their time, but some afterwards as well. So Habiba Masika, who I mentioned before, this Tunisian Jewish artist of, let's say, really the 1920s, her records, especially her nationalist, pan-Arabist records, definitely made their way to Syria and Lebanon, as well as to the Arab diaspora in the Americas as well. So some of them traveled quite widely. And the reason we know this, or I know this, is because, in some cases, it's just because the records ended up landing there, and sort of you can trace the path that way. But I've also been fortunate enough to do some digging in the archives of some of these record companies, and where they're tracking sales figures and also where the records are sold as well. So it depends on sort of what record we're talking about when we're talking about sales figures. But what I can tell you is that the popular records definitely sold way better than the Andalusian records. So sometimes an Andalusian record could be released and some hundreds of copies would be sold. But when you turn to a record like Mamak, one single version of it, like Lili Abbasi's version for Colombia, is selling thousands of copies a year. And that's just selling, right? There's many more people who are listening to it. And then when you multiply that by, the 6 or 8 versions of that song, suddenly you get a sense that some of this music was really, really everywhere. And they were advertised as well in the press, as well as in record catalogs. So sort of the latest by Lili Abbasi or whoever it was would be advertised too. let me see. Censorship. Rachel asked about, is this okay, the format where I'm just sort of looking at them? Okay, cool. And Rachel, I'm loving the festive lights behind you. Makes me feel warm on a -13 day. Okay.
Thanks, it's snowy outside here.
There you go. Censorship, of course, was everywhere, right? This is, after all, the colonial period, and there was much concern about music in various forms. You know, we heard some of that earlier. Some of the concern was that these musicians were veering from the authentic, right? So then you get things like the Cairo Congress of Music in 1932, which is supposed to sort of strip everything away, right? No more violins, no more pianos, no more whatever Mohammed Abdel Wahab is doing, no more of that, okay? No more Beethoven in Arab music. And so that's a form of censorship as well. When they're complaining about Mamak, you heard it with the Ghazala, where she inserts the word pourquoi and things like that. That was not to their liking. And part of that was because there was an interest in not being perceived as sort of eroding traditions, right? The colonial presence is one thing, but, you know, they didn't want to be, you know, all in sort of quotation marks, they didn't want to be seen as sort of contributing to the disappearance of traditional crafts, including music. But there's also censorship in terms of a great many search and seizure efforts, where they would go after records that were either nationalist, anti-colonial nationalists, or perceived to be so, and they would start these police manhunts across North Africa for these records. So one of them, for example, that I've written about is one that Blanc Blanc imitates at the end when he does the L'Abbasi impression, Lila Yibghadi al-Sahara, or you who's going to the Sahara, the conclusion drawn by some in Morocco at the time about this, an Algerian piece of housey, sort of like, you know, a sort of a song poem of much older origin. The French authorities got it in their heads that this, in fact, was a song about Alal al-Fasi, the great Moroccan nationalist leader who was exiled to the Sahara in 1937, which is exactly when that record came out. And so all of a sudden, all of those records are sought out, confiscated, destroyed. And so you could play this out with many different records, not just Jewish artists, of course, Muslim artists as well. But that really sort of picks up in the interwar period. And then, of course, as sort of the French grip on North Africa begins to weaken, that censorship regime will sort of go full throttle as well. And then radio is another piece of this. What could make it onto radio? What couldn't make it onto radio? And what radio are we talking about? So Italian fascist radio often played the things that the French wouldn't. And so people are tuning into that now, which becomes problematic. Let me see Tim's question, which I know I can't answer. Let me see. About foxtrot.
Yeah, let's read it out. Is there anything structural, rhythmic, melodic that defines a foxtrot? And Tim Abdelafouzen is asking that because I see the moniker, he says, foxtrot listed on US 78 RPM records as well. So is there anything structural that defines the foxtrot? And second question, is there a reason that record producers felt it was important to label a recording as a foxtrot or waltz, etc.? Was that helpful to potential customers or vendors, he asks?
Yeah, so Tim, a great question, and I feel like the real ethnomusicologists in the room can better answer what structurally defines a foxtrot better than I. But I think, you know, this is to your second question. I think the labeling was indeed important. And so the labeling would take many forms on a record. So sometimes it's just the appellation of sort of like sheikh or sheikha or ma'alima or whatever it is. That, so there's labeling there that sort of the record you're buying is by the master, right? And then at the same time, there are a number of styles that become in fashion. And were indeed a way to sell records, because it's also part of this, you know, it's, I think in how I sort of understand it is that it's like, it's part of this idea I'm working through, where there's a certain articulation of a North African modernity that we can hear through some of this music that both, of course, Jews and Muslims are taking part in. And so, you know, on the one hand, you know, like an labeling something an Arab foxtrot sort of like checks some boxes, right? It's rendered in a local language, but it's modern too, right? It's not Andalusian music. It's not for sort of the elite, right? It's not for only sort of a male-centered group. In a way, and this is a scholar of Egyptian music during this period has sort of thought about it, where, you know, this music, which is meant to be sold, had to be sort of marketed to both a father and daughter alike. And so some of that is accomplished when you label things Arab foxtrot, right? And then you get some of these sort of like, you know, what we might dismiss as ditties, right? Like a number of these ditties of the time about going to the cinema or not being allowed to go to the cinema or whatever it is, that again accomplishes that. So that's what I would say, is that it was important to label it, and it was important because I think it helped with sales. Thank you.
Okay, there are a couple of more questions. You can also just read them out by yourselves, the questionnaires, if you want to. So Julian Futter is asking, where were these recorded, in a studio or in a more informal setting? Were they pressed in Europe, or were there local pressing plants?
Yes, okay, so the recordings were the records were made in studios. At the beginning, all of it was done in North Africa, meaning like everything that was destined for the North African market was recorded locally in North Africa, and then the masters would be shipped to certain places. So initially the masters, depending on the label, were sent to places like Hanover, like many other records at the time, and then eventually sort of the finished good would make its way back to North Africa. They, you know, studio is almost like in quotation marks. So like a lot of these early places are hotel ballrooms, or sort of, you know, in some cases you can really get a sense that these spaces are really not ideal, right? You can hear certain things on the recording. You can hear a truck driving by, right? These are not soundproofed spaces and things like that. And then in other cases, you can get a sense that they sort of there was a lot of thought about where this was being recorded. By the interwar period, a number of North African artists are going to Paris to record there, and then end up staying there as well, and then sometimes quite tragically. So for sort of tragically and with you know, just horrific circumstances. So Salim Halali, for example, of course, is in Paris in 1940. As the Nazi occupation of northern France begins. He survives the war, but the lyricist and composer that Hilali turns to in 1945 when he steps back into the recording studio is a Tunisian Jewish musician by the name of Gaston Bshiri, and you could see it on that 1945 recording that we listened to. Gaston Bshiri was also in Paris, also marooned there in 1940, and was sent to the death camps in 1942, along with a number of other North African Jewish musicians. So all of that to say, they did end up, some of them ended up in Paris to record for labels that then sent some of those recordings back to North Africa, as well as among the North African population in metropolitan France. But of course, all of this to say, it's impossible to disentangle North Africa from a history of metropolitan France, especially during World War II.
Brenda, you raised your hand as well. You no? Okay. You're on mute. Vanessa is asking, I'm really interested in hearing more about Mamak and its translation. It seems like such an interesting conversation to the gender norms and women's sexual expectations.
Yeah, it's such an important question. You know, the way sort of like gender sexuality is working in these songs on like a number of different levels, because also, of course, when Lili Labasi, a man who wrote Mamak, is singing Don't Tell Your Mother, it has a certain cadence, let's say. When a woman sings it, it's got a totally different feeling to it, right? There's a certain role reversal that some of these women are taking on as they're singing sort of what was initially assigned as a male part. And now they're taking on, including often with male backing, with sort of like a chorus of men behind them. So again, you know, this business of, and each one of these songs is different. You know, like the music is more or less the same, but the lyrics are moved around. And again, whether it's a woman singing it or a man singing it makes all of the difference. So this idea of discretion, right, is that much more problematic when it's a male voice rather than a female voice. And you know, so part of the question of like gender norms is one, especially during the interwar period, we have this move of women who come to occupy the spotlight, again backed by men, and who are singing what would otherwise be the male part, and that's important to note. And I think the other thing, which I mean you know well, Vanessa, because this is so much of your research is bound up in these incredible questions, is the question of norms is changing, right? So there are other things that we didn't play, but where female musicians are talking about rendezvous, you know, that they're talking about meeting someone in the evening and stealing a kiss and the like, right? I mean, all things that are sort of we might judge to be sort of tame, but of course, you know, very much countercultural at the time. And I think what's important to note is that this music is selling very well, much better than the Andalusian music, for example. And so, you know, the question is, what does that tell us, right? It's one thing to like music; it's another thing to sort of, you know, change how you sort of perceive the roles between men and women. And so, and you ask who's buying the records. I mean, part of this conversation is also about sort of this question of like leisure time, pocket money, right? And so men and women are both buying these records, but you know, in some ways, even the buying of records is only a part of this conversation, because like, how are these records listened to? They're listened to in communal settings. You know, most people's first encounter with the phonograph is at a cafe. And so, you know, the buying tells us one thing, but then we have to sort of, like, much as scholars have done with the newspaper, right? I mean, this is sort of a communal activity that we have to keep in mind as well. And this goes, I think, to the question that we're all dealing with of borders. Right. I mean, you once the phonograph is on and running in a cafe, everyone who walks by can hear it. And so you get these really rich descriptions at the time of people walking by cafes, hearing a song, and then continuing on, but humming it to themselves afterwards. And so I don't know if that was their first encounter with it or their 1000th encounter with it, but just another sense of sort of the spaces this music is moving in. But I mean, great, really great point in question. I see Brenda has a hand.
Yeah, it's only to reiterate what I had put in the chat, because I think it says something so important about like the modernist influence globally, and the modernist influence coming from African-American music and dance forms. So indeed, even if the Moroccan and Algerian label of Foxtrot was not that, it then meant that those artists were aiming for something that had come out of African-American musician James Reese Europe, who invented this particular structural rhythm, the foxtrot, and used that to accompany the pre-World War I white ballroom dance team, Vernon and Irene Castle. And that their very lyrical style with this orchestration became a kind of global signature for that time. And I just thought it was so interesting.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's such an important point. I mean, you know, we, the sort of, that encounter, you know, we usually date it to sort of like World War II or after in North Africa, with the American and British landing of November 1942, Operation Torch, in which African-American soldiers, for example, now come to interact with not just the population in general, but we know from Maurice Medioni and others, come to really have an impact on the music of the place, sort of sitting side by side in the piano and learning boogie woogie and other styles as well. But you're right in that it starts much earlier, sort of the movement of this music around the world, and including to North Africa as well.
Yes, yeah. This was a beautiful presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for participating.
Thank you, Brenda. Yes. I think we have to wrap up now. Thank you, Chris, for this wonderful presentation indeed. Thank you for all the questions, for your participation. I want to repeat the title of your upcoming book again, Recording History, Jews, Muslims, and Music Across 20th Century North Africa, which is forthcoming from Stanford University Press next year. And before we close, I want to briefly mention our next event in the online series. It will be a concert by the Mohamed Labid Temsamami Orchestra of the Tetouan National Music Conservatory, featuring Moroccan singer Zainab Afelal. And the concert will be followed again by a Q&A session with the musicians. And all of you are kindly invited to join us for this special event, which is going to take place on January the 23rd at 3 p.m. GMT. So thanks again, Chris, and to all of you. Have a wonderful day, morning, afternoon, evening. Keep well.